Hi, Bob.
Hello, Heather.
We are in quarantine, and I am fortunate enough to be in my house.
In fact,
How are you?
it's a privilege to be in quarantine and not have to worry about a paycheck. Most Americans are either not getting a paycheck and in quarantine, or they are not in quarantine and they're exposing themselves to tremendous danger right now. So this is a bit of a privilege, even though I'm going stir crazy.
Yes, exactly. And you know, and I know that you have written a book recently, The System, and there's no book tour. When one quarantines, you can't leave, you can't tour. So, my first question for you is in your new book, The System, you make a strong case that the reason we weren't prepared for the coronavirus is not just Donald Trump's incompetence. But it's also inherent in how our system is now organized. How so?
Well, Heather, I would say probably 40, 50% of the lack of preparation has to do with lack of competence or the malicious, actually malignant incompetence of the current administration. But about half of it has to do with the way we are organized as a society, or I should say, non organized. We don't have a public health system really in this country. We don't have the kinds of social safety nets that are available to people in any other advanced economy, advanced society. We don't have the kind of system of healthcare that people have elsewhere. And so we were and are uniquely unprepared for all of this.
My next question would be about Jamie Dimon, who,
Ah,
as
yes,
we know,
Jamie Dimon, the CEO of the biggest bank on Wall Street, JP Morgan Chase.
that's it. So he recently sent a letter to his shareholders that said, "We are all in this together."
Yes, and I thought it was very touching. I mean, look at Jamie Dimon is the subject in many ways of my book because he is probably the quintessential representative of the oligarchy. I mean, the people in control of the economy and our politics. Jamie Dimon called me about a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, at my office in Berkeley, and he was very upset about something I'd written about him. And he and I squared off in that conversation. I didn't have a chance to really give him in detail and what I felt about what he was doing and why, even though he's a Democrat and he likes to talk about the wonderful things he and his bank are doing, he really is part of the problem. And so I wrote the book as part of a response to Jamie Dimon, but also a response to those who have enormous wealth and power in our system who don't perhaps fully appreciate or fully understand how they are distorting it. And also very important that everybody else understand.
And one thing that struck me too was your point about the moral obligation that people have to see what their role is.
I think it is a matter of public morality. We don't talk enough about morality. We don't talk enough about power in our society. But the fact of the matter is that over the last 40 or 50 years, people at the top have gained more and more wealth and income, and that has led to more and more power, political power. That in turn generates more wealth and income because they get all kinds of tax breaks. They change the organization of the so called free market to help them. And unless they fully understand their role, the abuse of power that is occurring under them, I think they're missing the boat. It is a matter of public morality. Everybody needs to understand this. And people who are struggling today, not only in the coronavirus, but also people even before the coronavirus who are struggling, need to understand that it's not their fault. It's part of the system. It's a system that has been organized and increasingly enforced by the people at the top.
Right. The old pull yourself up by the bootstraps doesn't really work.
No, in fact, pull yourself up by the bootstraps is part of the mythology created by the people at the top who have the wealth and power, and it's part of a mythology that is designed to enable everybody else to think everything's just fine. The free market is just exactly what is natural. It's a state of nature. If you don't pull yourself up by your bootstraps, something must be wrong with you. Well, that's the biggest con in the book.
Right. One thing that was interesting too is Jamie Dimon is a self-proclaimed Democrat, but he has called out both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren for socialism.
Ah, yes, socialism, the great bogeyman of even Democrats, even corporate and Wall Street Democrats, and socialism as their kind of problem, their bête noire, their villain, is ironic because remember Jamie Dimon, who accused Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren of socialism, he was there at the helm of J.P. Morgan Chase when he got a bailout from the federal government in 2008 after all the big banks had gone kaplooey. I mean, they had gambled away their deposits and all of their money to make even more money for themselves, and the taxpayers had to backstop them, had to actually bail them out. And then Jamie Dimon in 2017, at the end of 2017, led the way to getting a big tax cut for giant corporations and banks and the wealthy. Here again, if they define socialism as getting something for nothing or getting something you don't deserve, they are the worst practitioners of this kind of cartoon version of socialism. And the problem, Heather, is that we've got socialism for the rich in this country and one of the most brutish forms of capitalism of any other advanced economy. I mean, there's no place on earth that is a wealthy country that treats its workers this badly.
It's brutal. One other thing that I think is interesting is you use a term a lot in this book to describe J.B. Dimon and others and the system, which is oligarch and oligarchy. Tell us about that, please.
Term is a good old term, comes from ancient Greece, and it means, and meant then, and still means, a kind of society in which all the control, both wealth and power, is in the hands of a relatively few number of families, a few number of people. And that describes America today. Jamie Dimon is part of that oligarchy, as are many others on Wall Street and on corporate America and some of the billionaires who are not only wealthy, and this is not a screed against wealth, but they are using that wealth in all sorts of ways to increase their wealth through political power, through their control over our democracy.
And you touched upon this a little bit, but how do oligarchs and oligarchies, how do they maintain their power, Bob?
Throughout history, and this is going on right now, but it's interesting and important to understand that this is not a new technique. Those at the top, the oligarchs, have used a variety of techniques to hold on to their power that are exactly the same now. One is through a kind of mythology that God or some nature created their oligarchy. They're there because they deserve to be there. It's like in the 17th century, what was called the divine right of kings. That kings used to justify the fact that they had all this wealth and power. God so decreed. More recently, we have kind of market fundamentalism, you might call it, where the free market decrees. If you are a billionaire, so the billionaires say, so the plutocrats and the oligarchs say, well, if I'm a billionaire, I deserve it somehow. The free market has created conditions under which I am a billionaire. They don't understand, or they don't admit, and it's more likely they don't admit, that in fact, their position in the market is dictated by their own workings and manipulations of that market in terms of how they have changed the rules over time to benefit themselves.
That exactly. One other thing I keep thinking about when I was reading this book is that you wrote it before the coronavirus epidemic.
Nobody in their right mind would want the coronavirus to occur. Obviously, it's a nightmare for just about everybody. But the book does sadly foresee and foretell some of the issues and problems we see right now. I mean, for example, the fact that the biggest companies are getting bailed out by the government with almost no strings attached. In fact, with the small strings that were attached are rapidly becoming unattached, while average people are getting almost nothing, $1,200 per family, per adult. I mean, you can't get very far on $1,200.
Right.
You also see that the people who are most vulnerable, are the essential workers, so-called, people in warehouses and people who are delivery people and people on the front lines in our healthcare system. Those people are not only vulnerable, but they're not getting the protection they need. They're not getting protective gear. They're not getting hazard pay. They are really being put into the fight against the coronavirus, while the wealthiest people in society go off to the Hamptons, go off to their cruise ships, go off to places and where they can't possibly be touched.
So when I read the book, it did, I mean, it provides solace, and it provides to me an intellectual framework that makes me feel better and more grounded. Even though the system is broken, understanding the nuance of why and what we can do about it was so helpful for me. So thank you personally for writing this book, and for talking about it today.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you. What I tried to do in the book, in terms of giving people solace, and that's a nice word, and reassurance, is not just explaining how we got to this point. As you know, an explanation is not a justification. But I also wanted to give people a sense of how we get out of this dilemma, what they can do to actually change American politics so that the oligarchy is not in control. It's happened before. We've done it before. We did it after the first great period of time when the oligarchy was in control, the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. We did it again after the 1920s, when, again, the oligarchy asserted itself. And I think that there are lessons for how we as a nation took our economy and politics back in those two eras. And I want to convey what those lessons are, because it's inevitable that we will do it again. We cannot sustain the present course. It's not just the pandemic, it's wealth and power in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And the big divide in this country is not between the left and the right. It really is between democracy and oligarchy.
That is it. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Heather.